welcome everybody. I'm Henry Hale, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs here at George Washington University's Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies, also the director of that institution now, and also the director of our Petrock program on Ukraine. And we're very happy today to have two really great experts on kind of who work at the intersection of Ukraine and conflict to talk about their book, which is called Ukraine's Unnamed War, before the Russian invasion of 2022. So I won't preview it other than to say I think it's a fascinating read and is based on really impressive research done over many years, and I think is very, very relevant to the situation that we're seeing today. And I'll let them kind of lead that discussion and look forward to the feedback. Let me just say at the outset, again, this was in the announcement, but to reiterate, Dominique Arel is the chair of Ukrainian Studies and Political Science at the University of Ottawa, where they run a lot of great programs, including the Daniliev Seminar, which is probably the premier gathering of experts on Ukraine, social science, and other it's very interdisciplinary scholarly discussion on Ukraine. And he's also the longtime director of the annual World Convention of the Association for the Study of Nationalities, which is held every year in New York at Columbia University. And Jesse Driscoll is associate professor of political science and the faculty chair of Global Leadership Institute at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, and also the author of the award-winning book, Warlords and Coalition Politics in Post-Soviet States. And also a book doing global fieldwork. So we are very grateful to have both scholars here, so I think we'll turn it over to you and we'll ask them to talk for maybe about half the time, half the hour we have available, and that'll leave plenty of time for discussion. So are you going to, I don't know who's going to start?
Dominique's going to start.
Dominique? Okay.
All right. We thought 20, but we can go more than 20. That's all right.
Yeah, sure. Whatever you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, 20 is fine too. So.
Okay, so this is a book that came out about a year ago, which was, the book was in press in February 2022. We had to stop the press because of the full-scale invasion. Not that we rewrote the book, but we had to ditch the last chapter, which was kind of looking forward, and now we can no longer look forward. The story actually was completed. We thought that we were telling a story in progress, and it turns out that there's a hard stop. February 24, 2022. So the book is what happened before the Donbas War, 2014 to early 2022. So in the talk, we'll try to zero in on 3 points. The first two are what we consider some of the most interesting things we have to say in the book, what we call the Maidan narratives, and the outbreak of the 2014 war. What happened like really in 2014, how is it relevant? The third point, here's an attempt, since we're 2 years now into the full-scale war, an attempt to ask ourselves, okay, how is the book useful to seek to understand what's happening now and where this is going? And we call that the fate of the so-called political Russians. We'll explain what we mean by that. So that's the agenda. The Maidan narratives. So here our first point. It all kind of started 10 years ago during the Maidan protest that turned violent. And here we have coming out of Maidan, two conflicting narratives that, sorry about that, I will put it on, okay, mute, that we still hear, certainly on the Russian side, because the tropes are very much part of the current narrative. So we have a Russian narrative, we have a Ukrainian narrative, but a Ukrainian narrative that is almost identical or kind of intertwined with a Western narrative. So Russian, Western, Ukrainian on the other side. And not that we're trying to adjudicate here, but the Unnamed War is like our own narrative is seeking to analytically understand what actually happened? How can we understand these opposite, again, views? So we have 6 points here. The 20 February agreement, what's that? So you had the 3 months of protest and increasingly violent, and then it culminated with almost 100 people dying on the Maidan in February, and all-night negotiations between the then Ukrainian President Yanukovych and the opposition. Back then there were 3 opposition leaders of opposition parties, mediated by 3 diplomats from France, Germany, and Poland, and then you had a Russian observer. And that agreement stipulated that Yanukovych would stay on for another 6 months before elections, and that the next government, the temporary government, would be a national unity government of all regions. The Russian narrative is that this agreement was violated because Yanukovych fled the day after, and there was never any national unity government. The Ukrainian narrative is that actually Russia never signed the agreement, which is factually true. Russia never signed it. What really happened is that basically the agreement was very fast, very quickly overtaken by events. One, Yanukovych found himself completely without police protection. That was not foreseen by the agreement by anybody. And then he fled for his life. There was never any national unity government. It was kind of superseded by, or overtaken by events. The removal itself, that's a word that Putin keeps harping on, justifying the current war, that it was a coup d'etat. The Ukrainian narrative is that, in fact, it was a constitutional transfer of power. Since the day of his removal, you had a constitutional majority in parliament that included a lot of people from his former party that defected, basically, and voted for his own removal. What we point out in the book in great details is that the regime actually imploded. So a major story of the end of Maidan is the defection of the Yanukovych government leaders, ministers, and especially deputies. So the regime lost this majority within 24 hours because of the violence. The violence on Maidan, Russian narrative instigated by the West. The Ukrainian Western narrative in real time is that the Ukrainian government, then of Yanukovych, failed in its responsibility to de-escalate the situation. That was the constant narrative. What we document is the sequencing, that you had first the police attacking, but then eventually, as we'll point out here, strategic violence used by protesters to break a political stalemate. The violence by police seen as heroic. So after Maidan, some of the secret police, not secret, the riot police called Berkut, went back to their base either in Crimea or in Donbas, for instance, and you had ceremonies when they were glorified as basically the defenders of the nation and so forth. The Ukrainian narrative, Western narrative, is that the police kept using disproportionate, therefore illegal force against protesters. What we document is a process of escalation that led eventually to the demise of the regime. The violence by protesters is coded as a so-called fascist by the Russian narrative, with tropes going back to World War II, and you probably should all be familiar with that Russian constant harping that, well, that's not in our book because I don't know what really happened, but suddenly on February 24, 2022, the Ukrainians were less fascist and they were not suddenly Nazis. The denazification. That's actually a concept that the Soviet or Russian propaganda never used before. Maybe it was a sense that it's going to catch on better in the West if we call them Nazis as opposed to fascists. Anyway, it's the same thing, really. The counter-narrative is that Ukrainians on the square, even those using violence, were using that as self-protection, self-defense, sama barone. Although at the very beginning, the first instant of protester violence was seen as a provocation, like police infiltration. The police is trying to make us to believe that we're using violence, but quickly that changed to self-defense. What we show is it was strategic violence. What do we mean by strategic violence? It's violence that is committed with the express purpose of changing the political situation, such as forcing the government to negotiate, or at the very end to change the constitution, to amend the constitution, which is actually what happened ultimately. And the fate of Russian speakers, again, very relevant to this horrific war, full scale since 2022. The narrative from the beginning is that the so-called Russian speakers are under genocidal threat by the fascists. So the word genocide was already used in 2014 in real time, and especially during the annexation of Crimea. Of course, there was no genocide, but same way that there was no genocide in Donbas in 2022. The counter-narrative is that, in fact, Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers are united more than ever. What we show is that there was an inadvertent escalation having to do with a resolution regarding a language law that was right at the end of Maidan, that was understood as some kind of attack on the right to speak Russian in the East. And that was a political mistake. So that's for the first of our point. I'll leave it to Jesse to talk about the war in Donbas.
So, like all academic books, we have more in here than we can possibly summarize in a quick presentation, and like all academics, we can talk about our work endlessly. I knew Dominique was going to do that, but that's just one chapter of our book. I'm going to now summarize 5 chapters of our book, and I'm going to do it much faster. If you go read the book, you'll find that we really paid that much attention to everything. Dominique is really detail-oriented, and because we knew that we were going to take some fire from his community, we wanted to make sure that it was empirically bulletproof. That was the standard that we held ourselves to. So we spent a lot of time. This was not a rush to print. We really wanted to make sure that we had everything footnoted in Ukrainian from credible journalists and weren't inadvertently sliding something into the story that shouldn't be there. Because there was a lot of commentary at the time trying to slide things into the story that shouldn't be there. So without going into the detail of the sort that Dominique just performed, I'm just going to assert we tried really, really hard. And I'm sure that we didn't get everything right. There might be some chinks in the armor, but we tried very, very hard to describe something very complicated, which is the response to Maidan, differentiated across a very large and diverse geographic space. So this is protest data, off-the-shelf data from a Ukrainian sociologist about my age, Vladimir Shenko. These are extremely large protests that are anti-Maidan. So this is just a count of them, where you can see in the country you have lots of people turning out on the street who are angry about the process that Dominique just described. You could say that this is a picture of where there was support for what we just called the Russian narrative. Because the Russian narrative is not just disembodied words, it's obviously a 24-hour news cycle with imagery, with a whole bunch of storytelling going along with it, and you can always change the channel. This is where they didn't change the channel. This is where they went out on the street and in large numbers protested. Now that's distinct from what we in our book call coordinated sedition. We have in the back of our book safe, where you don't have to read it if you don't want to, a formal model, as some political scientists do in order to make sure that nothing you write is misunderstood, and to make sure that it's internally consistent. Math is helpful for that. But don't worry, it's gated, it's in the back, you don't have to read it if you don't want to. But it forces you to define words formally and define who the actors are, what order the actors move in, what do you think happened. So this term coordinated sedition, it's not like I was, running my hands over a large number of documents and as a post-structuralist I decided that, this is the right term. This is a formal term like many other formal terms defined in the back. The point is that there's a real difference, substantial difference, between what played out in Crimea, what played out everywhere other than Crimea, and then especially what played out in the eastern Donbas, the territory that we come to think of as the DNR and LNR. In Crimea, coordinated sedition is the elites acting together quickly to seize control of institutions and essentially take Crimea out of the Ukrainian polity before anyone can do anything about it. In military terms, you'd call it a coup de main, but that's not entirely accurate because there's so much sociological buy-in on the part of indigenous Ukrainian Crimeans, we say. You might call it a not quite hostile takeover of the government, but we have, for instance, a table of the number of military defections by service in the Ukrainian military. People who took off their Ukrainian insignia and just became Russian military across the different services. So that doesn't mean that Russia wasn't there, as we know they were, but they did not face a difficult operational environment in Crimea. And the second column, the streets were uncontested. Contra everywhere else in Ukraine. These are the anti-Maidan protests, but you also have pro-Maidan protests. And they would be clashing with each other. Oftentimes one would be taking place in one square and then you'd have the other taking place in a nearby square. Crimea is the one place where there's conspicuously no ground game for the pro-Maidan movements. There are some extremely brave Tatars, and I'm not trying to whitewash the heroism of those Tatars. The fact that they did what they did is how we know there were little green men to begin with. If they hadn't stopped the vote, I don't think Russia would have ever unveiled, and it would look even more like self-determination. So that is an important caveat there. But they weren't waving blue and yellow flags. That's not what those communities were doing. And the story ends with a quick voting exercise, let's call it, probably fabricated, but nonetheless Russia accepts the results and now Russia claims Crimea. That is the only place where it is that clean. Everywhere else it's quite messy. The language of game theory helps us here. In one place you have a stag hunt which is carried off successfully. In other places you have incomplete tipping phenomena. And you can see the tide rise and fall in different communities. We describe different outcomes, but ultimately what you have, to hit fast forward to the end of the book, is the absence of any coordinating mechanism, anything like the Party of Regions. And so you have, after things play out, no organized, institutionalized, let's say politically pro-Russia movement that's cross-national anymore. You have only the DNR, LNR, and Crimea. Now, the DNR, LNR is not a place that plays out, I have to say, according to the sequence of our model very well. In our model, the key actors are elites. And in the DNR, LNR, what we find is the elites actually just being pushed aside by new actors, new social actors, by the street. And so it doesn't fit the sequence of our model as well as the other areas do. Nonetheless, with these elites being pushed aside by street power, the bargaining that takes place in other parts of the country as they decide to make arrangements with this new government is attempted. In Luhansk, there are efforts to sort of have a conversation about autonomy, but it breaks down ultimately with violence that becomes quite terrible, and eventually the Russian military shows up, though it denies that it's there. And that gets the Minsk Accords. Minsk I is after the Battle of Ilovaisk, Minsk II is after the Battle of Debaltseve a couple months later, and all of that is really well understood. That leads to the frozen map that eventually produces Zelensky and eventually produces the 2022 war. much more that could be said on that, but I want to be respectful to time limits, and I want to get back to my co-author.
All right, so just on the Crimea referendum, since that was 10 years ago, of course it was fabricated, but probably there was a majority for annexation, the same way that we just had so-called elections in Russia. They were massively fabricated, but perhaps there was a majority for Putin and against nobody. Anyway, the political Russians. What do we mean by that? Because we tend to stick or use old, like classic categories of ethnic or linguistic or ethno-linguistics, Russian speakers, ethnic Russians, and so forth. But in fact, the reality on the ground is so much more complex that what really matters is not how you define yourself in the census or where you're from. The current chief of the Ukrainian military, the one who replaced General Zaluzhny, General Syrskyi, is actually born in Russia and his parents live in Russia. He's not a political Russian. Obviously, he's leading the fight for Ukraine. He's a political Ukrainian. So it's basically, if you go back to the narratives, those who basically will align themselves with one narrative or the other in an extreme situation. And the extreme situation was Russia resorting to military force in 2014. So the anti-Maidan protest that you saw all over eastern Ukraine turned into basically a street that became politically Ukrainian, except in this one place in parts of Donbas when you had an insurgency. So we think it's a better category than ethnic Russians, or you aligned, sometimes in the same family. I have a student and half of the family is politically Ukrainian and the other half is politically Russian. We're talking in Donetsk, not elsewhere in Ukraine. So, point number one. Now, that's, I don't know what you said, power, political Russians is diminishing. That is the appeal of political Russians. Sorry about this little confusion here. So after 2014, what we show in the book is that in the territory that Ukraine is controlling, so 93% of the territory except Crimea and that part of Donbas when you had the self-declared republics, DNR and LNR. So in Ukraine, Kyiv-controlled Ukraine, is basically the political Russians are massively diminished. They're not gone, but they're massively diminished. After 22, that's no longer in the book, but by all indications, they're on the verge of extinction, from east to west. But we're asking here the question, again, that is from our book, trying to ask a hard question about where to go from now, 2024, looking forward. The question is, what if Ukraine were to regain the 2014 territories? So, the Donbas self-declared republics and Crimea. Not the 2022 ones, it's so recent and it's pretty clear that the proportion of these political Russians is very, very low in Kherson or Zaporizhia. It's a different situation. We're talking about the 2014 territories. So, we're not asking the questions, what are the probability that the Ukrainian army will regain the territories? So that the question has been everywhere since the counteroffensive. We're not, the book, obviously we don't talk about that in the book, but the book is not useful to establish a military or political strategy to regain territories. That's not the question. We'll just assume here that the probability is not zero, even though the 2014 current situation is pretty grim. Who knows? You know, the winds of war could change. So the premise is that it's not zero. It may happen. And the question we're asking is, if it does happen, then what? In terms of what's going to happen to these political Russians? Because clearly there's a lot of them. Not in Kherson, Zaporizhia, or let alone anywhere else in Ukraine that's being bombed, like Odessa, Mykolaiv, but in the 2014 territories that have been outside of the political and media orbit or control of the Ukrainian state. So again, parts of Donbas, the heart of Donbas, and Crimea. What's the likely fate? So we're looking here at examples in history of how, in a sense, the question is a state regaining territories here, dealing with a population that has a very different make-up than in the rest of the state. So going back to the narratives, a population that would be more oriented towards the contrary narrative than the Ukrainian narrative. These political Russians, how many of them? Impossible to know, but it's sizable. It's sizable in Crimea, it's sizable in Donbas. One of the reasons it's sizable is because you had massive displacement of population, especially from Donbas. So the political Ukrainians, many of them left since 2014. And you also had in-migrations from Russia, but we won't deal with that. Like a population that is just Russian from Russia and just settled since, which is a problem in itself. And here we're dealing with a territorially Ukrainian population from 2014, but a very different make. And what could possibly happen? You'll hear the word plebiscite. It's been around, okay. Maybe there should be an international referendum about where people want to live. We didn't even put it on the board because plebiscite following a war just don't work. They actually didn't work after World War I. You had a lot of plebiscites, but those who were conducted were from areas that were fairly less contested than others. The area that eventually led to World War II, the so-called Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, there was no plebiscite back then. So we won't even how to conduct a referendum. Not there. Some kind of that's a theoretical here possibility, a shared sovereignty arrangements, kind of special territory controlled by two states. The city-state of Danzig in northern Poland, Gdansk now, in the interwar period, ongoing with Jerusalem. We don't think so because these two historic cases have been unmitigated disasters. So the theoretical option in practice doesn't work and leads to a great deal of violence.
But at least it's on the board.
But it's on the board. That one's on the board. Now we have the Ukrainian example. That is, you leave the population stay in place, and you have basically a constitutional arrangement and some kind of minority protection, autonomy, as actually Crimea had for nearly, well actually more than 20 years, right? 92 to 2014. Some other world cases and situations of violence. That also may be unlikely after everything that happened, particularly in the last 2 years. We leave it on the board. Everything that happened in the last 2 years, the destruction of Mariupol, the destruction of Bakhmut, now the destruction of Avdiivka, the destruction of Severodonetsk, every single town captured or by the Russian army through incessant shelling basically is left to rubble. And it's done in part by the Donbas army, like destroying their own area. So it's hard to to imagine practically that you'll get to some kind of constitutional arrangement, which actually was the premise of the Minsk Accord, not for Crimea. Crimea was implicitly understood as gone forever. It was not even in the Minsk agreement. But Donbas, the whole idea was that the Donbas would get some autonomy. And the Ukrainian government had to sign, because this was an agreement literally with the gun to their head, because the army lost twice militarily against the Russian divisions, and it was totally politically impractical to implement. Because of a conviction on the Ukrainian side, perhaps validated retrospectively, that the Russian army would never leave. The Russian army was not even in the agreement. It was the sense that they were there, but they were not theirs. That leaves us to those three options, which are not pretty, but may actually, again, the premise is if Ukraine is able to reconquer territories, we could actually witness forced displacement. Basically, the population, or a great deal of the population, just leaving or fleeing. You have the Krajina, that was a region of Croatia with a Serb majority in '95. That's eventually what happened. So in recent history, the classic case was the Greece-Turkey so-called population exchange, which incredibly enough was managed by the League of Nations. It was extremely violent. So that could be an outcome. That Ukraine comes back and the population, lots of the population actually leaves. Not just the recent settlers and the war criminals, but the actual population. Another option is that much of the population stay, but without autonomous power, and the government actually encouraged them to leave, but not forcibly. Not forcibly. The current situation in Hong Kong, of course, the Israel situation with the occupied territories, and one other possibility is one of toleration here. Immigration is encouraged, but basically the policy is assimilation. So the project becomes making the local population political Ukrainians. Not forcibly, but politically over time. Some of you may be familiar with this historical case. For the longest time, and actually 2 world wars kind of were fought. I mean, that territory found itself in the midst of the First World War and the Second World War. Alsace-Lorraine, between the territory disputed between France and Germany, when you had German speakers, but probably most of them with a French political identity. And should they be in France or should they be in Germany? And eventually, after 2 world wars, they ended up in France and as political French, with some minor language kind of concessions, but essentially is making them forever French. And so we're likely to see one of these 3 options. Why? Because of what happened in 2014. What happened in these territories in 2014 actually matters. It was very distinct from the rest of Ukraine. And that's where the political Russian identity, to some extent, expressed itself. Which, of course, absolutely doesn't deny the role of Russia and the military intervention. And we'll leave it at that and take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes?
I don't understand why you're dealing with something that's so remote. right? You start out by saying, this is a very remote possibility that Ukraine gets these back. Why not deal with something that's realistic, which is, what's gonna happen to the Ukrainians if the current situation continues for 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations? You open yourself up to the charge of, here are academics dealing with a hypothetical that maybe has a 1 in 1,000 chance. I just don't understand the motivation there. The reality is the Russians are there, and it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians will be able to get them out, at least the way that I read things, no matter what Biden says, especially what's happening with Trump being there. That's the reality. So you want to know what's going to happen to those Ukrainians. What's your feeling about those? Are they going to be, how would they fit into a scheme like that? So I'm sorry to ask kind of a provocative question, but it seems to me, people talk about elites, academics. This is a prime example of that, dealing with something that's very, very remote in great detail.
Okay, that's a fair point, but it's the official position of the Ukrainian government to retake all territories, the
Sure.
1991 territories.
Let me tell you something. I played tennis with a group of Ukrainians, Americans, Ukrainians from the embassy. And you would write a book on this, how don't make it any secret, but how their attitude has changed. If you asked them 6 months ago what's going to happen, they would, these are young guys in their 40s and so on, high level guys. Oh, we're going to get every square inch back, every square inch. That talk has been gone.
But
Okay, that's reality,
Yeah.
right? So what Zelensky is saying
Sure.
and what reality is are 2 different things.
Okay. We're not dealing with the probability. We're just assuming the probability is not 0. The point is, when we say the political Ukrainian identity was greatly diminished in the rest of Ukraine, Ukraine becoming more Ukrainian since 2014. Since 2022, the political Russian project or identity is virtually vanished in Ukraine, let's say, the territories that it has been controlling since 2014. That's for sure.
Yeah,
We could have talked about that, okay? But those Donbas and Crimea territories are different, so we're trying to explain how are they different, and what could possibly happen if one day these things happen.
All right, let's open it up to some other questions. I see Gerard in the back, then Paulina. If you could just introduce yourself, please.
Okay, my name is Gerard Tull. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech in the area. Congratulations on the book. I think it's a terrific book, and I particularly commend you for doing something extremely difficult, which is that you took on this idea of a civil war, and in the face of a script where the term civil war was very, very politicized as part of a sort of Russian talking point. And you point that out, but then you stick with it by giving us this political science literature on it. But I wanted to ask a question about the way in which you plot the book, which is you effectively run it as there's an equilibrium game, there's bargaining between the center and the regions, and then you have sort of coordinated or uncoordinated secession. And I think it's a wonderful analytical narrative that you lay out. Here's my question. The center of that is this sort of triadic nexus. But there is another level game, which is a sort of at the international geopolitical level, which is between great powers. And that's why I don't have, in my own work, I don't have a triadic nexus. I have a quintic nexus. And so I'm wondering about how did you figure out the relationship between these two? And it's very, very relevant because your book is called Ukraine's Unnamed War, and there's a lot of people now saying, this is not Ukraine's war, this is Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that other level, where, and that's the surprise of February 2022, where Putin attacks Ukraine, but he thinks he's really attacking the West. So how did you kind of come to decide that you were going to look at this sort of domestic level game, and then sort of bracket the other one?
So I'll take that, that's all right. And thanks for coming, and thanks for the great question on the book. I really appreciate it, Gerard. I'm gonna give a kind of a lawyer's dodge type answer, but first I wanna hit it like straight on. The language, if we had it all to do over again, if we could get in a time machine and go back, we probably wouldn't have been as courageous as you're giving us credit for, and we would have just used the language of insurgency. What would have allowed us to access all of the same social science literature without saying something that was so offensive and so radioactive to so many Ukrainians, right? And that it was a problem that the interventions took the form that they did. I'm very pleased that I got to have a back and forth with Timothy Brick about it, for instance, and I've become friends with Timothy. But at the end of the day, sometimes we're used by the words we use, and like the language of civil war did something for the Russian bargaining position in this three-level game that you're talking about. And I think it has become clear since 2022, no one uses this language anymore. This is all kind of a historical debate. But it's clear that the language was meant to have an effect on a bargaining outcome, which was coercive and was a kind of Dominic had the gesture of a gun to the head. Take this deal, because if a war breaks back out again, you're going to lose it. So some sort of federal autonomy deal for the East, it's kind of the best you can get. And that has baked into it a lot of coercion taking place at the system level, which the entire Civil War bottom-up framing can be accused of whitewashing and cloaking. And we can be self-aware about it, and we can include, a game that has Russia acting as the third player, and but that's me dodging your question. If I answer the question head on, we did it with difficulty because we understood ourselves to be describing a situation that needed a kind of a hold-your-nose conflict resolution setting to save lives in the DNR, LNR at the time that we were doing the research for most of what became the book, and that was the analytic framework that we used. And I think Dominic would agree with that. Now, the lawyer's dodge part, which may be interesting to some of you and may be completely uninteresting to others, but we are interested in the actors. Let me just go back to this. The actors in our model are these elites, right? It's the decisions of people on the ground who are Ukrainian. So, some people, whenever you use the language of game theory, they are repulsed by it for any number of reasons. One reason might be that it's kind of treating Ukrainians like game pieces, or something like that. The way we see it is just the opposite, is that the whole point of the game is to let the Ukrainians play and have the Ukrainians be players and to give agency to Ukrainians. So from the perspective of Ukrainians making choices, really, really high stakes choices on behalf of their families, in a contested setting where there are guns out, in that environment, Ukrainians have to make a decision not quite knowing what's going to happen at the system level with Russia. Because Russia lies all the time. Russia says they're going to come and then they don't come. Russia says they're not even there and then they are there. So you have to, in this environment, make a decision that's a probabilistic one, not knowing what Russia's going to do. And so we treat it as a game where Russia is the third actor, but you have to, there's a probability that you have to kind of estimate, and then you act. And this starts to get into exactly the sort of academics talking to themselves exercise that we were accused of doing before, so I don't want to dwell on it. But that's how we think about it, Gerard. And the reason that we don't try to create a fully integrated general game, like we have one appendix which is sort of, here's the IR game, it takes about 2 pages to write. Bargaining over Ukraine, where Ukraine has no agency at all, where it's just an object on the table with 2 players with knives out. And we don't even talk, we kind of say this is the way that John Mearsheimer talks about the world. It's not how we're talking about the world, but this is how a lot of people talk about the world. And then we just leave it. We don't try to integrate that into our model, both because I think it becomes too much math, and that's not really how the world works, but also because I think that they're just non-overlapping magisteria. Like if you are the kind of scholar who cares about what Ukrainians think, you're already rolling your eyes at John Mearsheimer. And if you are someone with a really short attention span who can't really be bothered to learn the names of Ukrainian cities or pronouncing the names of Ukrainian politicians, you're not reading our book anyway. So that's how I would answer your question in the spirit you're asking.
Let
Okay.
me, if
Yeah.
I can, add something, or formulate it differently for benefit of the audience here. So, basically in 2014, you have an insurgency in the east. What that means, you've got a bunch of guys that are taking up arms and think of themselves as political Russians, so they buy into this Russian narrative. Whereas in the rest of Ukraine, the street turns political Ukrainian. So the Russophones, etc., and for 20 years you had that, you mentioned the bargaining. Well, in the street, the bargaining ends basically with we're choosing Ukraine. We're choosing Ukraine. So, what was this bargaining for 20 years that Jesse talked about and that we document in the book? What is the relevance? Because it seems to be so now remote in history. You know, Ukraine now, you look at the surveys, and 90%, 95% of the population behind Zelensky, whether they're in Kharkiv or in Zakarpattia, right? Complete unity. But basically, you had elites, in particular in Donbas, in Crimea in particular, that, and we document in the book, in 4 occasions, twice in Crimea and twice in Donbas, blackmail the center in the bargaining, saying that they could, if they had to, kind of resort to the Russian card, defect, so to speak. Sometimes even they'll say, we'll call the military. I mean, it happened in 2004. And then with bargaining with the center, there was compromise. So, in a sense, they were suddenly using a political Russian identity in order to get something from the center, like autonomy in particular, in the case of Donbas, when we want to be in the government, we want to be central representation. So that was the game that particular Jesse in the book theorized about, use a model. And that breaks down in 2014 because essentially the political Russian identity, so as we say, vanishes, well, is greatly diminished in much of eastern Ukraine, but you do have an insurgency in the east. And the point we're making, that's very controversial. Understand, the emotions are running so high and we're all emotional with what happened in 2022. But to address your question about, the 3-level, 5-level game, Russia sees that it's really the West and the United States dealing directly with Russia or the European Union. Our book is about ground level. It's about agency. It's about what happened actually on the territory of Ukraine. But we do believe that the political Russians in Donbas and Crimea had also agency. They were not simply pawns of greater powers, in this case, Russia. At some point, Russia sends the military, the game changes. But for much of 2014, it's very, very messy. And that is the connection that may seem completely like remote, but who knows what's going to happen in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. We have no idea of what could possibly happen.
I want to interrupt.
That precisely those two territories are so different, were so different back then, and have remained so different. Yes?
I'm trying politely to interrupt you. But the other thing to say, look, we have, to go back to this slide, right? We have not gone out of our way to whitewash Russia's role as a bad actor in this book. Like, if you actually go read the book, it's emphatically not what I think some people worry it is, which is an effort to take Russia out of the story. What Russians hate the book because we take America out of the story, right? Like, they just can't look at Ukraine and look at this event and not see Victoria Nuland, AmCham, USAID. And we actually, other than a footnote or two, are kind of like, yeah, I don't know, these look like Ukrainians to us. and we don't take that narrative very seriously. I must say, because I don't take it very seriously, and neither does Dominique. And so to the extent that, another way to answer your question is that in your work, you are much more willing to engage with, I think it's fair to say, a pretense of even-handedness, that there are two imperial projects both taking place on the territory of the near abroad. I'm very motivated by, you know how I feel about your work, Jared. But like, we don't do that. What we do, in part to avoid having to get into that, is we just tell a bottom-up story with Ukrainians so that we don't talk about politics in either Moscow or Washington, D.C., so that we can have a short book. It's like half the length of your book.
Okay, let's let Paulina in. Thanks. You just introduce yourself, please.
I'm Polina Sinovets. I am
It's thin. It's a thin volume.
Patrick Fellow here, and I am actually not an expert in Ukrainian policy, but I'm Ukrainian. I'm mostly dealing with international relations with Russian military policy, but I have, of course, a lot of reflections and questions on your book. First of all, congratulations. I think that the book brings one very important message, which is adding to the fact that our Ukrainian authorities are really lacking the strategic thinking, because the main idea we come and regain the territory by the 1991, and then what happens really with this population, with these political Russians and other. So the question is, what should we do next? Never, at least as I understand, appears in that narrative. The main thing is to win, but whether this victory will be something which will bring Ukraine prosperity or not, this is a question for me. I mean, again, about the question about, for me, your message is that probably it's better to concentrate on what is remain. Maybe I will sound anti-Ukrainian, but in this regard, but better to concentrate on what is remained and to enter all Euro-Atlantic structures now than to fight for something which will bring the new collapse of the state because of that political Russians who may start ruining the state from inside, as it would happen if the Minsk agreement were ratified. I mean, again, I'm wondering on your reflections. First, second, I would have a comment about these political Russians. Again, I'm not an expert in Ukraine, but I'm from Odessa, and I know that political Russians, they have not disappeared, they are just sleeping. There are a lot of people in Odessa who say nothing about the war. Of course, they do not say, yeah, we are supporting Russia. No, they say nothing. They are sitting and waiting, and then if something goes wrong, I mean, for the sake of Russia, in this regard, then they may wake up and say, I was always supporting Russia's coming. Because, I mean, like on the public people's level, I know friends of the friends of the friends of the friends who are like that, and who are very much sympathetic to what Russia is doing, thinking that Ukraine is guilty in everything. And this is like, it's not, I would not say this is a majority of Odessa population. Of course, there are a lot of intelligent, educated people and so on, but people who are not from the academia, who are not from some kind of intellectual circles, like white public, a lot of them are like that. And one more question about Maidan and the Crimea, because the Crimea case, because you have described it as something already predetermined, like, I mean, of course, it was predetermined by the previous policy of the Ukrainian government, all this renting out military bases to Russia in Crimea, and the increase of the Russian oriented population. But the question is, after Maidan, there was a short time. So what was, I think, what was the first actions of the new government came up after Maidan? It was the cancellation of the law of Kivalov-Kolesnichenko about the language.
Yeah, the 2012 language law.
Yes. And then it was sort of the trigger moment for Russia to say that, you see what is happening, the Nazis, fascists and so on, they will kill you all. and whatever, and then it triggered the situation. On the other hand, it was just a subjective issue. So my question is, what if new Ukrainian government did not start from ruining that and thought a little bit, focused a little bit more on how to reconcile and how to engage these people living in Crimea, Crimea as a part of Ukraine, instead of just breaking what was built up and then making that kind of chaos in their minds. Do you think it would help, or it was already predetermined by the interests of the political elites, by the Russia's actions there, and no matter what Ukrainian government could do, it would end up in the way it ended up? Thank you very much. Sorry for too much.
No. I think clearly we should have allocated multiple hours for this discussion. Unfortunately, we only scheduled one. But let's get in. I think David had one more comment, and then we'll give the last words to the authors.
Yeah, I'm struggling.
Identify yourself, please.
David
if you don't mind.
Abramson, I work at the State Department, Russia analyst. I'm struggling with this concept of political Russians, or political Ukrainians, in lieu of ethnic. I'm not saying that ethnic is better. It's problematic. People have multiple identities, and they shift. But it's not, I'm assuming, without having read the book, I'm assuming that you have maybe identified it as a more fluid category. But where do you put people who in occupied Zaporizhia, Kherson, who are, decide to become the mayor of the occupied town, in other language it would be, collaborators with the occupiers is the way it could be called. And similarly in the Donbas, where you have a leadership that is very Kadyrov-like, where people, because they're in the situation where they are, and similarly within Ukraine, they're making choices that at the individual, family, whatever level, that is not that is either to save their lives or as opportunists or a whole range of reasons. And I don't know how much you capture that in the book, but I worry that the concept of political Russians sort of glosses over a lot of that, and maybe you don't, but if you could explain that.
So just keeping in mind that we probably will need to leave a lot of this discussion to informal conversation afterwards. Let's turn it over to the authors for finally respond to whatever you want to respond.
Sure. I'll give Dominique the last word. I'll answer your question quickly, David, and then I'll try to ping on one of yours and let Dominique pull that claim out. I think the whole conversation about the future of political Russians is just us making stuff up. It's not in the book, and it's just speculation about the future, so take it with a grain of salt. The way that we use political Russians in the book formally, to get back to our formal language, is in the context of a bargaining game, there's a zero-sum pie, which is divided up, and when we're trying to figure out what those divisions look like, why do we say it's zero-sum? We say that there are some issues that are salient for people that get bundled together. The teaching of language, the teaching of history, geopolitics and geoeconomics, in terms of which trade bloc you're going to join. All of that is actually in zero-sum. And you can come up, it doesn't mean it's indivisible, but it does mean that it's zero-sum. Those four issues are what, at least before 2022, when we got into larger existential issues of loyalty to the state and executions and stuff, when it's just a political pie being divided and you're thinking about a basket of goods that you're voting for. And sometimes you put on a performance identity and say, I'd rather die than be part of this state, but what you really want is a lower marginal tax rate, because that's how performances work in politics sometimes. What it meant to be political had those four components. Now, Crimea. On the 23rd, we know Putin ordered the troops into Crimea. That's also coincidentally the day that afternoon they voted on the language law. So I think the idea that it was causal in the way that your question implied that they passed the language law and then, Putin sent troops in. I just don't think that that can be true, because I don't think it works that way. So I think the sharp answer to your question is I think Crimea was overdetermined. I think it was spring-loaded, and I think that, there's a lot of evidence for that, both in our book and I think now in secondary sources. I don't know what any new government could have done, given what we know psychologically about Putin's theory of the case was, to have negotiated anything on Crimea. I just don't believe it, and that's me quoting Michael Fall. I mean, that's just what, expert testimony on Putin's psychology has led me to understand about the case, along with what we have now come to understand about the timing of the military operation. So that's the easy of your questions to answer, and I'll leave the hard ones to Dominique.
Overdetermined is not the same as predetermined. There's nothing predetermined.
Yeah.
2022 was not predetermined, took everyone by surprise, the Ukrainians first and foremost, Zelensky and us, basically the entire world, except American intelligence in the last several weeks before the actual invasion, because it was too extraordinary even to contemplate. Crimea was certainly not predetermined. There's a terrific book by Elie Knott about Crimea before 2014, and where the pro-Russian sentiment, as expressed politically, was relatively weak. Actually, the pro-Russian party, well, the Russian Nationalist Party in the Crimean parliament had 4 seats.
So by the time you get to mid-February, Dominique,
Yeah, but that's my point.
Yeah.
That's my point. Suddenly, you've got a drastic change in the political landscape.
Exactly.
And what we document in the book is that not in people's head, but in actual the capacity to organize, there was no political Ukrainian movement, street movement, political movement
That's right.
to see in Crimea. And that was recognized in real time by the new government in Kyïv, who are desperate, is saying, already we know that the police is defective, we can't rely on our own police in Crimea. But that was the exception to what was happening everywhere else in continental Ukraine. So not predetermined, but, as you said, overdetermined. Now the political Russians are sleeping. That's a very good point. I think, again, our book ends in 2022, so what we document is that the political Russian organized identity, first and foremost politically, like the Neo-Party of Region, was still around. Medvedchuk, the infamous Medvedchuk, was leading one of, the main Neo-Party of Region party, but greatly diminished. So suddenly, I think they had 1/3 of the seats that they used to have. So the kind of the political equilibrium that characterized the previous 20 years was suddenly completely out of whack because of a very, very strong trend and growing political Ukrainian identity that we measure basically in terms of capacity. We don't get into people's head. We're not saying that certainly in Ukraine, we know in occupied territories there are collaborators, but of all kinds. The current law is extremely expensive, but this is not the subject of the talk. The people, quote unquote, collaborate to help people in the health, education sector. Should they be seen as the same as war criminals and so forth? But what we've observed, certainly everybody observed since 2022, is that there's no organized political identity in the Ukraine that was controlled, the territories that Ukraine controlled since 2014. That's the complete contrast with what happened before. But if Odessa were to fall under Russian occupation, then you'll have a certain proportion of the population that'll go along. The same way that, by some indication, that's what's happening in Kherson and Zaporizhia, which is a different situation. You're asking, what should Ukraine do? Well, we're not making a policy recommendation, in terms of concentrating, but I think you're right on. What we're trying to say is that if Ukraine is to reconquer, let's say, southern Kherson, Zaporizhia, Mariupol, that would be extraordinary. Managing the extant local population, because most have actually left, whoever is left, would not be a major problem. But if they were to get to the 2014 territory, suddenly maybe would get back to, not in terms of insurgency, but how to manage a population when there is a core portion of it that's clearly buying the political Russian identity. And Minsk failed, is not about to be resurrected, right? So that's the question we're asking. That Ukraine may find itself with the kind of problems. We're not talking security issues with Russia. That's not what we're addressing. Of course, the Ukrainian state will need to be in a situation when it can't be attacked anymore. Yeah, it is fluid. Of course, it is fluid. Like ethnic identities are fluid, but I think it can again be measured with a certain number of political and social indicators in terms of the capacity to organize it itself. That's what we're focused on. And so it's, in other words, it's not the language you speak or how you declared yourself before. It's basically your relation to the state. It's basically your loyalty or affiliation, your identity to the Ukrainian nation or the Ukrainian state, or the Russian nation and the Russian state. And that's the political identity we're talking about.
Well, unfortunately, we're at the end of our time, but congratulations on the book. I think its
Thank you.
importance is very well reflected in the active discussion that it's generated here today, and I'm sure will continue afterwards in various forms. Thank you for leading us on a great discussion, and please
Thank you.
join me
Thank you very much.
in thanking our presenters and authors.